Uh-oh. Did I do it on air? I'm live. Alright guys, keep in mind that I am not really familiar with the software, so if I do a bunch of newbie stupid stuff, that would be why. I guess we're gonna hang out a bit and give some people time to show up. I'm talking to John here. Okay, so there's also a lag, so whenever I say something, I think it takes 10 or 15 seconds before you guys hear it. So if you type something in the comments, it may take me a while to actually respond to it. But also, I'm going to try to keep this into sections. So I'm going to talk about basically 4 different sections. I think we'll probably get through 2 of them today. But at the end of each section, I'll go back and look at the questions and then try to answer questions. Yeah, so we have a pretty big announcement. We're adding our system data. It's actually already, Plico's already released it, so whenever you get your updates, you do your update, you'll have the system data. John has a video on, like, basically a tour of the data and, like, what to look for. If you've already got our dictionary, then whenever you see a component breakdown, there's like an S button next to the components now. And if you click on the S button, you will see the system data. And there's also, say if it's a component that you can't break down into other components, then you have to scroll down to the bottom of the entry, and there's a link that says something like system data for, and then it'll list the component there. So yeah, it's really cool. We're really excited. This actually was part of our demo from the very beginning. Yeah, we're just now getting it actually into the dictionary, but it's really cool. I mean, yeah, you really need to check it out. And then obviously, if you already have the dictionary, there's no charge or anything. It's included. If you have the mini version, I don't think it's included in the mini version, but it's included in Essentials and the Expert version. So yeah, so I'm gonna have to ask John questions about how to use the software every so often. So if I stop talking and like look like I'm typing, that's because that's what I'm doing. Trying to figure out if I can screen share. Originally we were going to use a different type of software, but because John's in Japan, I'm in the UK right now, there was just too big of a delay. It got just really kind of stupidly long. Add a source. Amazingly, I know how to do that. Browser. Media source. Huh. I'm not sure this is gonna work. Sorry, guys. I might skip on this for now. Just because this is going to take too long, and I'll just start reading. Oh, display capture. Okay. Okay, there we go. Right. So the talk today is about John. The title he gave it isn't exactly what I prepared for, and it might slightly give the wrong impression because I'm not going to do any imitations of people speaking Middle Chinese or Old Chinese. What I am going to do is go over the data, go over basically how do we know what ancient Chinese sounded like, since we obviously don't have any MP3s sitting around of people from those time periods talking. So I've prepared, this isn't completely in order. Let me go to, this is kind of the main theme here. These are the four main points I'll talk about, and like I said, I'll probably get to the first two today and then the next two on a different video probably next week. So basically what I'm going to talk about is, yeah, how do we know what these things sounded like? Zoom in on, I don't, Okay, so apparently I'm not zoomed in on it, but I am on my computer, so I don't really know why. I don't know how to do it. It's just, okay. Okay, I guess I have to do it. I guess Alt-Tab. I'm an Alt-Tab guy, and Alt-Tabs apparently don't work. So, unless you're trying to get away. Okay, once again, hopefully this is working. I'm depending on John to tell me what he's seeing. So, and I can't type back to him. So, okay, I'm just gonna keep going. Okay, so basically there are four types of, I guess evidence. I'm not sure that's the correct way of saying it, but four ways of knowing what the sounds were in ancient times. So there's basically the four types are explicit data, basically somebody saying, hey, this character sounds like this, or the initial of this character sounds like the initial of this character. And then what's called, or what I'm calling, first-hand data, and this is not an industry standard or anything, it's just what I'm calling it. So for me, first-hand data is evidence that's internal to Chinese. So say character A gets used for character B in a text, and so we're seeing an actual native, of whatever language, if it's Middle Chinese, Old Chinese, or some dialect thereof, or some interstate stage in between those two or after them, we're seeing an actual Chinese native speaker of that language using characters in a way that tells us something about how they sounded, or the relations, usually more of the sound relation between two or more characters. Then we have secondhand data, which is external to Chinese. And then we also have analysis and logic, which is a very powerful tool for understanding these things. So now I'm going to go back over those four in a little bit more detail. And then after that, then I'll start into the discussion about the explicit data. So with explicit data, we have things like rhyme books, which are books where you can look up a character and it tells you this character has this initial and has this rhyme. And it doesn't do that directly. It does it with what's called 反切 spellings. Then you have rhyme tables, which are much more explicit, but they also appear much later in history. And they actually are tables that show you the initial it actually shows the place and manner of articulation. So the place in the mouth that it's said and what's going on in the mouth to say it. So like they grouped like sounds. So you have like g, k, h would be in a group, and d, t would be in a group, and stuff like that. And then you have things like sound glosses, where in some ancient text, a commentator is commenting on a part of this text, and they're saying, this character sounds like that character, or this character has this 反切 spelling, or something like that. We have dictionaries, like the 说文解字, which actually points out the sound component of characters, so that will tell us, hey, this, at least, I mean, he's not always right. Xu Shen, the author of the 说文解字, he's not always right, but it does for sure tell us that a Han Dynasty scholar thought that these two things were very close in sound, or close enough that this could be the sound component of that character. And of course, it's not that simple. There were Tang Dynasty commentators that changed the text and stuff, so you have to take that kind of thing into account. But the simple version is that's what a Han Dynasty scholar thought about these characters. And I guess I've already mentioned the 反切, which is a way of using two characters to spell another character's sound. And then you have other formulas like 读弱, which means this character is read like, so you'd say character A, 读弱 B, and that means character A is read like character B. So that's basically explicit data that we have. Then we have first-hand data, which is evidence internal to Chinese, but it's not somebody directly telling you, hey, this character sounds like that character, but they're using the character in a way that tells you the sound relations. And this consists of tongjia. And tongjia, if you're not familiar with it, is extremely important. If you're trying to read any kind of ancient text, or even modern Cantonese, because they use that same principle in modern Cantonese. When you're trying to write the way a Cantonese speaker talks, as opposed to standard written Chinese as they think of it, they use the principle of tongjia. And this is extremely common, especially in pre-Qin dynasty texts. So if you're going to read that and you don't know tongjia, it's going to be baffling. Because basically what that means is, tongjia means a character is used for its sound. And it's not used, it's like when you write Malaysia in modern Mandarin, you use ma, but you're not using ma because you're trying to express the idea of horse. You're just using it for the sound ma. Then you have jiajie, and jiajie is actually the same thing as tongjia, except that you've used this tongjia so many times that the jiajie meaning takes over the character meaning. You have the way foreign proper names are annotated in Chinese texts. So like a person's name or a place name, and we could have clues to that place or person name based upon other ancient historical records like Roman records or Greek records or Japanese, Korean, depending on what time in history we're talking about. Vietnamese. We have variant characters, which are basically two characters that have the same sound and meaning. In other words, they represent the same spoken word, but the structure of the characters is different, or maybe they have a different sound component. You can compare these things together and know something about the sounds between characters. We have rhyming text. So the reconstruction of Old Chinese, for instance, is heavily based upon how characters rhyme in the Shijing, or the Book of Odes. We have variant texts. In Chinese, it's called yiwen, where you have one text quoting another text, but they do it a little bit differently. So they might use a different character that has the same sound or a similar sound, or it could actually even represent a change in sound. We have loan words. Like, I just wrote a paper for a conference that was about basically when you're trying to analyze ancient forms of written Korean using Chinese characters, which stages of Chinese should you be taking into account. And in that paper, one of the big sections is loan words from Old Chinese into Korean. And you can tell due to the phonology of Old Chinese and how the word ends up being in Korean that it was during the Old Chinese period that these words were borrowed into Korean. So we also know something about ancient Korean sounds and modern Korean sounds and different stages of history where the Korean pronunciations of characters are annotated in texts. So we have that kind of evidence as well. Like I said, we have how characters are used in modern dialects. Well, what does that have to do with it? It has to do with being a starting point for trying to understand how ancient people might have used characters. Like in the main different, like for instance, you take written Cantonese. In written Cantonese, when you're trying to write the way a Cantonese speaker talks, you basically just use the normal character for that word you're writing if you know what it is. If you don't know what it is, then you use a character that has the same sound and same tone. It doesn't matter what the character looks like, but it has to be the same exact sound, the same exact tone. To whereas in, say, like Taiwanese or Minanhua, it's very different. And there's many reasons for this. Probably, I think the main reason is that people don't actually learn the Taiwanese pronunciation of characters in school, to whereas in Hong Kong or in China, I don't know if they're still doing it now, but they used to learn the Cantonese sounds of the characters first, and then later they would learn Mandarin. But in Taiwan, writing Minanhua is a mess. And I'm not saying that to be critical, I'm just saying it because there's so many ways that it gets done. Like, you can take the meaning of a character, like for instance, there's a Wu Bai song where they're saying gong, wagali gong, gong, meaning to speak, and they use the character shuo hua de shuo, when this is clearly should be the character jiang. So what they're doing is it's like a tongjia based on the meaning of the character rather than the sound. But then they also will use Mandarin pronunciation to write Taiwanese. And obviously that's not an exact correlation. It's just something that's close enough to the thing you're trying to write to where you get an impression of the word they're trying to write. Okay, so anyway, using these modern dialectical ways of writing can give us some insight into possibly how the ancients did things, or the possibilities of how they did it. So these topics I just went over, I'm going to cover in detail today, and then these next two parts I'll probably have to cover a different time. So when we also have secondhand data, which is data external to Chinese, which is I just got a comment, but I'm not really. Yeah. Huh. So, sorry guys. Guess I choose webcam. Okay. I guess I'm going to try to switch between reading this document and talking to you guys. Oh, actually, I think I can do that. Well, I'm not really sure. I know I should have practiced on this software a lot more than I did, but I mean, if you had a look at the list of stuff I have to do every day, I'm trying to write my PhD dissertation in Chinese, and I have to have it done by December, so needless to say, that takes up a lot of time. Although I have to say, I love it. I love writing my dissertation. Okay, so I figured out a way here where I can kind of be on screen with you guys and then also be able to read this document. So the secondhand data has to do with loanwords into other languages, Chinese characters borrowed into other languages like Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and the phonology of nearby languages. So, for instance, in the reconstruction of Old Chinese, one of the things that have kind of become more accepted over the last, say, 15, 20 years is the idea that they had sesquisyllabic words in Old Chinese, which is kind of a okay. I'm getting real-time tutoring. Sorry, guys. Okay. Yeah, on this. Yeah, and I actually have no idea what's actually even appearing on the screen. I have this little window where I see stuff going on, but I'm not sure if it correlates 100% to what you guys are seeing. In fact, I think maybe it isn't. So you guys are still seeing my screen, but I've selected the webcam, which shows me the webcam, but I don't think it's showing you guys the webcam. Yeah. It's like I click on webcam and I click OK, and then it doesn't. Maybe you have to hit. I click the eyeball, but it's not changing anything. Anyway, I'm just gonna keep going. I don't want to spend all this time on. I mean, hopefully, guys, you can see my face here, but can't. I'm missing out on some prettiness. So phonology of nearby languages. I was just talking about the sesquisyllabic words in Old Chinese, where that just means one and a half syllables, and people ask, why is it 1.5 syllables? Because the first part of it can only have a schwa as the vowel. In other words, like makram, but they can't say makram or mekram. It can only be makram. So because it can only be that sound, it's not considered a full-on. It's considered, like, I guess, a reduced syllable, so 1.5 instead of 2 syllables. And so when you're like, a lot of very traditional minded Chinese scholars hate this idea because to them Chinese is monosyllabic. When people say mono, well, that's a whole different ballgame, but monosyllabic doesn't mean that every word is a single syllable. It just means that the morphemes are based on morpheme being a meaning unit. The meaning units are monosyllabic, not necessarily that all the words are. But anyway, they look at Chinese as being monosyllabic, strictly monosyllabic, and that's always been monosyllabic. In fact, Baxter tells a story about, he gave a talk in China about modern Old Chinese phonology, and some guy came up to him, I don't remember who he said it was, but came up to him at the end of the talk and said, 你讲得很好，可是你忘了一件事情，中文是一个单音节的语言。 In other words, what you said was great, but you're forgetting one thing. Chinese is monosyllabic. But, well, why does he say that? Because he grew up speaking this monosyllabic language, but that doesn't mean the language as of thousands of years prior to him growing up was also monosyllabic. And there's a book by Matistoff about Sino-Tibetan languages, and in this book he has a graph which shows the different syllable types, or basically the basis of each language. So like a monosyllabic language can become a sesquisyllabic language, which can become a bi or disyllabic language, which can, and it's like a cycle. Like these different languages can turn into each other over time due to certain processes of change. And this notion that Old Chinese has sesquisyllabic words fits very clearly into this diagram, or into this situation where all the languages around China are, either monosyllabic, was changed to disyllabic, was changed to sesquisyllabic. So it fits very cleanly into this. So in other words, it's not weird that Chinese would be this way if all the languages around it were that way. So that's how we can use our knowledge of languages around Chinese to help us understand if a specific concept about Old Chinese was reasonable or not. And then there's also just the knowledge of languages in general. And Baxter calls this the naturalness criteria. So, for instance, there's this is a real technical thing here, but so Rusheng is a Middle Chinese tone category, and basically it's a word that ends in PT or K, and like say a lot of Southern dialects still have this, like Cantonese. So like in Cantonese you can say tak 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 taka. So this tak where it ends with a K, that's called an entering tone, or Rusheng. And in Old Chinese, they also had Rusheng, and then in Middle Chinese, you have another tone called Chusheng, or the exiting tone, maybe. I forgot what they call it in English, Chusheng. And there's a lot of connection between words that are in Old Chinese are Rusheng, and then in Middle Chinese, you get this massive amount of connections between Rusheng characters and Chusheng. And Chusheng is the tone in Middle Chinese which becomes, roughly speaking, the fourth tone in Mandarin. So people are asking themselves, how come these endings with PTK are having so much connection with endings that don't have PTK at the end? And it's all based on this Chusheng tone category. So one of the proposals is that Old Chinese didn't have any open syllables. In other words, an open syllable is a syllable that ends in a vowel. So like ma is an open syllable, to where ma wouldn't be an open syllable because it ends in a consonant. Or like mang is not an open syllable because it ends in ung. So if it ends in a vowel, it's open. If it ends in a consonant, it's closed. So they proposed that, like, you had two types of basically Rusheng in Old Chinese, one of them being like the Cantonese say tak, but the other one would be something like dog, dog, where it's voiced, and that the voiced, like the dog, the voiced one disappeared over time, which is why it looks like you have open syllables and closed syllables having this connection. But here's the thing, there's never been a language discovered in the history of the world that has only closed syllables. So that tells us, it doesn't tell us that this proposal is logically impossible, but it does tell us that it's highly unlikely. Because it would be the only language we've ever come across that has this set of properties that it only has closed syllables. And even people that think that this was the case, they say, well, they had to have some small amount of open syllable words because like infants, why does the word mother or mom or ma, why does that start with an M in languages across the world? Now, not all languages have mother start with an M, but a very significant amount of them do, and the reason is ma is a very easy sound to make. All you got to do is touch your lips together. Ma, it's one of the first sounds that infants make, actually, or can make. Or like even ba, ba, like in Chinese, father's ba 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 ba. It's the same mouth movement, ma ma ba ba, right? That's very different from saying a sound like call, which takes like a significant amount of control over the muscles in your mouth to be able to make such a sound. Which is why, certain sounds are stable. They'll get into a language and they stay there for a long time. It's because they're easy to make, basically. And then sounds that are hard to make, they might enter a language for a while, but then they end up getting, they end up disappearing, basically, because they take a lot of effort to make those sounds. So they start reducing the amount of effort, which changes the sound, etc. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that understanding the phonology of languages around the world, understanding the phonology of languages around China, and also other parts of the language like grammar and word usage and stuff, while these aren't direct evidence for Chinese, they're indirect evidence of how languages work and what's quote-unquote normal within languages. And that leads us to the last point, which is analysis and logic. For instance, we use the comparative method to reconstruct, like say Old Chinese. We make predictions based upon our reconstructions, and we make these predictions, and then if we come across evidence that shows that our prediction's wrong, then we know, hey, there's something wrong with our theory. Or if we come across something that shows us that the prediction was correct, then we know, hey, this part of the theory is correct. I already talked about that. Knowledge of sound changes from other languages. That's also extremely important because you got to remember, sound in a language has to do with the human mouth, right? And we all have the same mouth. Our mouths are trained differently, but the muscles, when you're a kid, when you're an infant, they're all the same. And like a lot of times people try to make these claims that Chinese is some language that's completely different from other human languages, but it can't be because they have the same mouths as everybody else. They just get trained differently when they learn to speak Chinese. So a sound change has to do with how people are holding their muscles in their mouth differently. So it's based on the human mouth, right? So that's kind of the constraint on what sounds are in human languages, basically the sounds that a human mouth can make. Which is actually very encouraging if you're learning another language, because if they can make that sound, so can you. I mean, it might take you longer to learn how to do it, but you're going to be able to do it because you have the same muscles. Your muscles are trained differently, so you got to figure out how to train your muscles to make the same sound they're making. And the more exotic that sound is, the more difficult it'll probably be to do it. But the thing is, if they can do it, you can do it. And that's not, okay, I can't even see the questions. Like, I can't even see what's going on YouTube, but I just got a message from John saying that there's a question. Actually, I'll go ahead and answer the question whenever I finish this section here, because that's kind of a clean break between sections. Okay, then you have stuff like explanatory power. Like, if I have a theory and I take this one theory and explains 6 things over here, and that's competing against another theory that explains 2 things, the one that can explain 6 is it's more likely to be true. It's not necessarily true, but it's more likely to be true. And then you also have Occam's razor, which you can use pretty much anywhere. And you know, there's a gazillion ways of saying Occam's razor, but essentially, if I have 2 competing theories with everything else being held equal, the one that's more simple is more likely to be true. Yeah, so these things are all very powerful tools that we can use to understand what different versions of older versions of Chinese possibly sounded like. So, having said that, I'm going to go into this section on explicit data and then kind of go into a lot more detail about these things. But let me look at this question first. Okay, so can you tell me who wrote the critical review? Because I've seen. Okay, so let me just say the question so we're all on the same page here. Sorry. Black Rose asked, "What do you think about the book Old Chinese and New Reconstruction?" Yes, I read a somewhat critical review in a journal. I was curious about your opinion on how accurate you think the reconstruction is. Okay, so I actually know Baxter. I've met Saga, not in person, but no, I did meet him in person. He came to National Taiwan Normal University several times. I think I met him there twice. I met him online a couple times before that when I was visiting Baxter. And then also, my only English class that I ever had in the Chinese department at NTNU was about this book you're asking about. My professor, he asked me to take this class, and in Taiwan, when your professor asks you to do something, you do it. So I was the only native speaker in there, but we did that whole thing in English. But okay, so I've seen several criticisms of Baxter's stuff. Some criticisms have more merit than others, but there's like this. I don't remember the guy's name, but I've seen he's written a journal paper, I think, about it. But I saw a video, and he starts off saying, "I don't know what I'm talking about," but, and then he goes on to criticize Baxter in a very cutting way, I guess I'll say. And my impression was, I think I watched the first 5 or 10 minutes of video, and my impression was, you should have stopped after "I don't know what I'm talking about," because he really didn't know what he was talking about. He was saying that the whole thing is just complete conjecture. This is not true. It isn't complete conjecture. When you're talking about Old Chinese, there's a bunch of questions that aren't answered, and the reason they're not answered is because there's not enough evidence to know for sure what's going on. And that's true for anybody. It doesn't matter what the reconstruction is. But there's also a core of reconstruction that is very stable. For instance, I don't know, I mean, if you're reading journal articles, I guess you know something about Old Chinese, but so the rhymes, and when I say rhyme, what I mean is okay, so the Chinese, in modern, when we talk about Mandarin syllables, we talk about initials and finals. So if I say, like, dang, the initial there is duh, it's just the first consonant, and then ang is the rhyme. Okay, and then it becomes a little bit more in depth in Mandarin when you start bringing medials into the question. But basically, in old Chinese, we get the basic rhymes come roughly from how characters rhymed in the Shijing, the Book of Odes. I mentioned this earlier, and So you have the rhyme yang bu, because you call a rhyme category in Old Chinese a bu, and in Middle Chinese they normally call it a yun, but you can also call both of them yun bu. But the way people talk and write about this stuff, they usually use bu for Old Chinese. So yang bu means all the characters that rhyme with yang. Not in Mandarin, but in Old Chinese. In yang bu is reconstructed as a and g in Old Chinese. And if you notice, it's still a and g in Mandarin. So that means this sound has been the same for the last 3,000 years, roughly. Which means, and if you look at basically anybody's reconstruction of Old Chinese, their yang bu is going to be a and g. So that isn't controversial at all. I mean, so you have this core of reconstruction that is completely not controversial. Then you have like things that get towards the outer edges of it, which become more and more controversial. So getting back to Baxter and Cigar, Baxter 1992, the Handbook of Old Chinese is, I think it's considered extremely stable and reliable. Like I've never heard anybody other than, I've heard traditionally minded Chinese scholars criticize it, but I've never heard, well, yeah, okay, in the English speaking community, I think it's extremely well respected. Like Schussler made his own, he calls it minimal Old Chinese, and what he means by that is basically kind of what I'm talking about this core of reliable reconstruction. He takes what he sees as the core of Baxter's reconstruction, and he uses that for his own purposes. Christopher, that name's really familiar. Christopher Harpsmeyer. I don't think I've read that one in particular, but so when people are criticizing this new book, it's not about, they're not saying it's 100% wrong. They're not talking about this core that I'm talking about right now. They're talking about other issues that probably have to do with, I was talking about the sesquisyllabic words in Old Chinese. We're probably talking about that kind of thing, and what's called in the book pre-initials. In fact, I wrote a blog post about this on Reddit because somebody was like, what's going on with pre-initials? How can something be pre-initial? The answer to that question is the initial has to do with the root. So it's been proposed that Old Chinese has root words with prefixes and suffixes, and it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar to, like, in English we have the word get, and then we have words based on get, like beget, like, which means to get kids, I guess, beget, or to forget, and we're adding these prepositions to a root word, which changes the meaning of the word. And then we also have suffixes like forget versus forgets. And Old Chinese had a system, it's more constricted than the English one, but it's still very similar. And it has to do, the criticisms that I've seen have more to do with this, with these proposed suffixes and prefixes, and the evidence that they're using is also a thing. Like, actually, when I was when I saw Cigar in Taiwan, one of the people criticized, I'm trying to remember, this was I don't know how many years ago this was, but a lot, probably at least 4 or 5, if not 7. He was talking about a prefix, and the reconstruction was based upon 2 words in some Sino-Tibetan language. I don't even remember which one. It might have started with an L. But anyway, the person asking the question was criticizing Cigar, and he's saying, how can you base this reconstruction just because you only have these two words in this other language? That could be this could be a coincidence. And Cigar said, no, it can't be. It's not statistically likely to be a coincidence. I disagree with him on that point. It could be a coincidence. Whether it is or not, I mean, I don't really know. I don't even remember exactly what the example is. But I actually, like I said, I know Baxter. I've spent back in 2007. I did a 2-week intense seminar with Baxter and Chen Jian. And we were in class all day, every day, and I just, and then I did the same thing again at Oxford in 2009, also with Baxter and Chen Jian. So I've heard Baxter talk about these things, and I've talked to him about stuff. He actually said something wrong. He was talking about, this has got nothing to do with Chinese, he was talking about general relativity, and I happen to know at least a little bit about that. My undergraduate and master's degree is in engineering, and when I was doing my master's, I ended up taking, my last semester I was very tired of engineering, so I took cosmology from Steven Weinberg, 1979 Nobel Prize winner in quantum field theory. And then I also took black hole theory, and both of these classes were very heavy into specifically the math of general relativity. And Baxter was saying something about light bends around massive objects, and I waited until nobody else was listening. I waited till a break, and I said, actually, that's not true. Light doesn't bend around massive objects. Space-time bends around massive objects, and light travels straight through bent space-time. And the reason this is important is because when you're talking to somebody, one of the things you want to get a feel for is how open is this person to correction. Because if somebody tells you that they're never wrong, they're probably wrong. I like anecdotes, so if you don't like anecdotes, you're probably not going to want to listen to my talks, but I broke a tooth, and I had to get a tooth replaced, and then I started getting these bills, but my insurance covered the thing, so I was like, why am I getting these bills? And then they sent it to a collection agency, and it's like, I'm not responsible for my insurance company paid for this, and I ended up going and talking. I can't remember if I called or just went down there. But I talked to the office manager, and she's like, it's not even possible that we didn't turn in your application for your insurance. And when she said that, I knew immediately she screwed up. If somebody tells me it's not even possible that they made a mistake, in my opinion, it's highly likely that they're making mistakes. Because people that think they might make a mistake, if you're doing things carefully, you plan that mistakes may happen, and then you try to plan to avoid them. But if you think that by nature you can't make a mistake, you're not even going to plan, because why plan for something that you can't do? Anyway, it turns out that they indeed did not turn in, they screwed up. They didn't turn in the information to my insurance company, which is why they didn't pay me, or pay them. So anyway, I brought this thing up to Baxter, and I pointed out his mistake. I was very nice about it, because I used to be in the teaching Chinese department, and I really made the guy that started that department very angry one time. I didn't mean to, but it made him really angry by pointing out a mistake, and I happened to do it in front of a lot of people. So I'm very aware to not do that. It doesn't lead to good consequences, I can tell you that. But so Baxter was extremely open to the idea he could be wrong, and he was like, "Oh, okay, well, I won't say it that way anymore." And then actually, I just thought of another one. I was at a conference in Taipei with Ufa Bergstrom, I think his last name. He's a student of Baxter, and we met a Chinese scholar, or a Taiwanese scholar. I won't say who she is, but I said, "Oh, this is Ufa. He's Baxter's student." She goes, "Oh, I don't like his 6-vowel system for Old Chinese." It was a very awkward moment, because he actually had held his hand out to shake her hand, and she didn't take his hand, and made this comment about not liking Baxter's 6-vowel system. And later on, I think that probably happened around 2008, because I told, like, when I saw Baxter again in 2009, I told him about it, and he goes, "Well, I could be wrong." So anyway, Baxter, for somebody who doesn't have a hard science background, he's got a very scientific attitude about a lot about things about Reconstruction. But Cigar, on the other hand, this is not a criticism. Those two guys have very different personalities. Like, Baxter actually wrote a paper, but when Baxter does stuff, he'll go over it and over it and over it and over it and over it, and he still just wasn't happy, 100% happy with his paper, and apparently it had gone on for a long time. So Cigar actually took the paper and submitted it to a journal for Baxter, and it got accepted. So Cigar is, for him, he's the kind of guy who's much more likely to take an idea and run with it, whereas Baxter is a guy who's way more conservative, and he wants to go over it and over it and over it and over it and make sure there's no mistakes, that kind of thing. So, and this comes out in the Reconstruction, in this example where Cigar is saying, no, it's not possible that this is a statistical anomaly, that there's definitely a relationship there. I don't believe that. I think that particular example, I think Cigar is not correct in saying that it can't be coincidence. It can be. But not only do I trust Baxter because I know him and because I've heard him talk and because I've read all of his stuff, including the book we're talking about, but also because of this thing about predictability I mentioned earlier. So, like, I was doing the analysis for 学习的学, and so 学习的学, I mean, the modern form has a lot of corruption in it, but there's a thing in there that looks like it could be building, or what most people call roof, where it's like, if you could see me, ding, that thing. And that thing in old China, in like Shang Dynasty, Zhou Dynasty texts, actually Shang Dynasty, I think, Shang Dynasty texts, it looks almost exactly like Liu, like 6. And it looks so much like 6 that some people say they're the same character. Other people say, no, there's actually differences. And so when I was doing the analysis for 学习的学, I'm looking at different paleographers and what they're saying about that thing, because in the modern version it doesn't have that dot in the middle, but the original character did. I say original, there was 20 versions of that character in Jiaguwen. But I looked at the phonology for Liu in Mian, and man, the phonology was exactly the same. And Baxter had proposed there was an M pre-initial. I think it was something like, if I'm going by memory here, so I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was M kruk, like kruk or something. I don't know how it would be said. Kruk. And that was the exact pronunciation for, it was either for 学习的学 or 我觉得的觉, because those two are very closely related. Like 觉得 has to do, the original meaning has to do with coming to realize something or having like an epiphany kind of a thing, whereas 学习 is to learn something, and those two things are obviously very closely related. But when I saw that Liu was pronounced Nkruk, which was the same exact pronunciation, and he didn't reconstruct these based upon this character. His reconstructions have nothing to do with the paleography. And in fact, I actually wrote him an email and asked him about it to be sure. Nothing to do with it. So when I'm using this reconstruction and it answers a question, like there's two characters that look very similar, and I find out this one of these things has the exact pronunciation of the character that I'm analyzing, that gives me a pretty high degree of confidence in Baxter's reconstructions or Baxter cigar reconstructions. Okay, so what I am saying, okay, let me say what I'm not saying. I'm not saying at every single character they reconstruct, I'm 100% confident of that. I'm not saying that. In fact, I've actually sent Baxter questions about characters, and he's actually changed his reconstructions based upon my character, or based upon my questions. That's happened 2 or 3 times. What I am confident of is the overall process, the overall direction that they're walking in. I'm pretty confident of that. And it's happened with other characters too. So, and when I come across these things, like I said, it gives me confidence. So, as far as the guy that you're talking about, can you characterize what he was criticizing exactly? I mean, is it to do with pre-initials or anyway? You can type that in the comment. I can't see the comments. John will have to look and send me that. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and continue with what I was saying, and then we can come back to that. I've already actually spent a lot of time on the question, but we'll come back to that when we finish the first section. Okay, so some of the explicit data, sound glosses. Now, what sound glosses are is you have a commentator, which, if you want to know, the Chinese word for commentator is, well, there's several, but the main one is 注释家. So a person that puts annotation and explanations. So you have these commentators, and they're commentating on some earlier text, and for characters that they think, hey, the average reader isn't going to know what's going on here, they'll add pronunciation, or they'll add meaning, or they'll add a comment about it being used in some other text. But basically, they commentate on, a lot of times, on sound, and there's a bunch of formulas they have. So I have a list of these formulas, and this is from South Coblin's book on Eastern Han sound glosses, or Eastern Han, Dong Han sound glosses. So you'll come across it, and they'll be annotating a text, and they'll say X do Y. In other words, X reads Y, or a more natural translation, X reads like Y. Or X do way Y, same thing. Or X do way blah 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 zhi Y. And I'm sure what's in the ellipsis there is that they're describing like the type of Y. So like, for instance, like da xiao de da can also be read like dai fu, I think it's first time, dai fu, or anyway, it doesn't matter. It's either, I'm just pretend it's dai fu. So what they could be writing in that ellipsis would be X 读为大小的大, or 大小之大, to let you know which reading of da they're talking about. Or they have X 读皆为 Y, which means X is always written like Y, no matter what the meaning or what the context. X 读当为 Y, X 当读为 Y, X 当为 Y, or take X as Y. X 当作 Y, same, take X as Y. X 读如 Y, X is read like Y. So earlier I said that X do Y is more like X do, or X, read X like Y. And so the 说文解字, the way it often does this is to say X 读若 Y. I think there's like one instance of it saying 读如, X 读如 Y. But in the 说文解字, he has a very specific formula, which is X 读若 Y, which means character X is read just like character Y, or like character Y. You have X 都与 Y, X 都与 Y 同. Okay, so you can tell just by virtue of how many different formulas are going on that this is quite a common thing. So this happened a lot with at least in the Eastern Han Dynasty, there was a lot of this going on. And then there's another one, a thing called zhiyin, which like means direct sound. So they'll say X in Y, or the sound of X is Y. Okay, so this type of stuff was common until what I talked about earlier. This fanqie spelling became common. So fanqie appears late in the 2nd century, and so there's some formulas associated with that. So you have X in YZ fan, where Y and Z are two different characters, or YZ qie, and it depends on basically the time period that you're reading it. I think early on they said fan, and then later it switched to qie. And the reason they stopped using fan, and I'm going by memory here, so I could be wrong, but it had to do with not reminding people of rebellion or something. I don't know. It actually sounds like something that like the modern Chinese government would do. Like, you're not allowed to say fan, even if you're not talking about going against the government. But so I have the example, and this is like, I think this is actually the first entry in the Qieyun. And the Qieyun is a rhyme book, and it basically lists out a bunch of fanqie spellings for different characters. So the example here is dong de hong fan. And so what that means is the character dong, you take the initial from de, and you take the rhyme from hong, and then the fan just tells you that the previous two characters is a fanqie spelling. So dong, I'm not exactly sure how to say this. The Middle Chinese is something like dung, and for the Middle Chinese would be dok. I mean, I don't take that too seriously. I don't know tonally wise what that would sound like. So you take the T from dok, and you take the from hung or hung. I don't know how to read that. And then you get the pronunciation duong. Okay. Keep in mind, if you come across fanqie spellings, you cannot just stick Mandarin in here, or you cannot just stick Cantonese in here, or you cannot stick Taiwanese in here. This spelling, any fanqie spelling, is basically valid for the time period that fanqie spelling was created. So like, say you're reading the Kangxi Zidian, which is, I don't know, 400 years ago, and they have a fanqie spelling. Probably those spellings come from Middle Chinese. So you can't use Mandarin or whatever language the Kangxi guys were speaking. I mean, it could be Middle Mandarin. I don't know. I'm not very familiar with stuff after the Han period. But you can't just use any random Chinese. I mean, obviously you can't, right? I mean, it was made. I actually had a professor. I won't say his name, but there's a lot of weird ideas about Taiwanese. Like, when I say Taiwanese, I mean Taiyu or Minanhua in Taiwan, where people think that, like, people will actually tell you 孔子他讲的是闽南话. And that's just beyond nonsense. What isn't nonsense is that there's a lot of extremely ancient sounds within Minanhua. That's completely true, totally on the level. But to say that Confucius spoke Taiwanese, it's just, there's no way that it's true. I mean, it's not even possible that it's true. But having said all that, so I had this professor, and he's like, oh, Taiwanese has these old sounds. So he tries to work out some fanqie spellings with Taiwanese, and then, it doesn't work out. And then his conclusion was, 反正那些fanqie也不太正确. I'm just like, yeah, that's not really the conclusion here. The conclusion is don't try to stick Taiwanese into Fanxie. Fanxie is accurate for Middle Chinese. But I actually myself made this mistake. I used Mandarin, and it actually came out to where the sound was right, but the tone was off. And I asked Baxter about it, and he goes, yeah, because you're trying to use Mandarin. And I was like, oh, yeah, that is dumb. Okay. So then there's another thing called, and I'm not sure how to say this word because I never heard anybody say it, but paronomastic glosses, which is basically a punning glosses. And apparently the commentators that used these pun glosses actually took them very seriously, and they thought that there was an actual etymological connection between the two characters. Even though, but from a modern perspective, I'm telling you what I read in Koblin, I'm not telling you what I know personally, that they're actually quite amusing a lot of times because they're, from a modern perspective, they don't look etymologically related at all. But the people that wrote them took it very seriously. And so these also have these formulas. So like X, Y, yeah. Which anybody who's done any programming in Lisp, that looks like a Lisp command. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. It's not important. And then you have Xj, Y, which X, Y just mean X is Y. Xj, this thing X is Y. Xj为言 Y 也 Xj 言 Y 也 I guess that's saying the sound of X. I'm not sure. It could mean the sound of X, or it could mean when talking about X. As to X, it's Y, or the sound of X is Y. I would have to read up on it. Okay, another set of direct evidence is actual just dictionaries, because obviously the purpose of a dictionary is to clarify the meaning and or sound of something. I mean, that's what we use modern dictionaries for. See, I need to take a drink. I need a drink. So dictionaries, and especially ancient Chinese dictionaries, they don't do stuff like modern dictionaries. So a lot of times the way they relate, the way they'll explain a character with another character that sounds like this character, or even several characters that sound like it. And I think the first dictionary, if I'm not mistaken, is the Arya, and that's from like roughly 300 or the 3rd century BC. And I'm assuming you guys can, if you guys can see the text I'm looking at here, I'm gonna post this in the video. And for all these ancient dictionaries, I found some websites, mostly C-text, but I found some websites that I personally use if I'm looking up something in one of these dictionaries, so that you guys can get in there and like look and see how they did stuff and play around with it. It's pretty interesting. And then you have Fangyan, which is the dates I gave here, which is 53 BC to 18 AD. That's actually just the time period that the author of this book lived. So obviously he wrote that book sometime within these dates, probably towards the end of the period. And Fangyan basically tells us a lot about the Han, or the Eastern, I think the Eastern Han dialect. Yeah, it has to be, because that's, yeah, the Eastern Han dialect situation. So we actually know a lot about different dialects and geographical locations of certain sound changes. And actually that paper I mentioned earlier, this came up because the character feng, meaning wind, in Old Chinese is something like palm. So I think it's P-O-M, palm. Or maybe that's probably pronounced, it's either palm or bomb, depending on if he includes aspiration in that or not. But in when you get to the Han Dynasty, there's a split. There's already, like, I think the Western dialects had an so it already become something like pyung, and then the Eastern dialects it was still, I think it was like pyam or something. And notice I'm changing the initial there because eventually the pia becomes a pha. So Baxter talks about different sound changes, and he'll sometimes, if he has evidence for it, will point out this happened in this part of China. And I think he's using mostly this Han Dynasty dialect information, either directly from the Fangyan or from Koblen, because this Koblen goes into this in the Eastern Han sound glosses in a lot of detail. Then everybody should know and love the Shuowen Jiezi, which is from roughly 100 AD. We know from the Shuowen. Oh, by the way, Fangyan will say here you say this word this way, but in this other, and they'll usually name city names or region names. They'll say this word that way. And some of these are like really surprising. I think it's from the Fangyan. I could be wrong, but there's because I'm going by memory from years ago. But for instance, the character B, as in pen or writing instrument. I'm pretty sure it's the Fangyan that says B in this area is pronounced bulu. So he's actually says B is pronounced bulu. And the ancient or the old Chinese for B, I'm pretty sure is beat or something like that. That's what I think. Actually, that's what it is in it's bat in Cantonese, but I think in old Chinese it was beat. So bulu, if you say that in Cantonese, would be bullet. So beat versus bullet, right? Which is this thing I was talking about earlier with this sesquisyllabic. That's not an easy word to say. That's actual textual evidence of either a sesquisyllabic thing going on, or maybe taking a single syllable word in one dialect and turning it into a two syllable word in another dialect, but it's the same sound. So you have beat versus balut. Well, I'm saying lut based on modern Cantonese. I don't remember what it is in Old Chinese. Yeah. So anyway, this Fangyan has a lot of really interesting information about how different things were said in different parts of China. And then, so back to the Shuowen, it tells us, it actually tries to give character structure. It analyzes character structure, and that's actually what it's really not very good at. And, well, it depends on what you mean by that. So the Shuowen is analyzing Xiaozhuan, or the seal script, and there's a lot of corruption in characters by the time you get to seal script. So for characters that exist in basically Shang Dynasty and Zhou Dynasty and Jinwan or Jiaguwan or something like that, the Shuowen does not generally do a very good job explaining those character forms. What the Shuowen does actually really well is original meaning for characters that were created near the time of the Shuowen. And that makes sense because those are going to be the easier ones to do. But that actually he does pretty well. But at any rate, we can know what a Han Dynasty scholar thought of certain characters, given that Tang Dynasty people may have changed what we're looking at. But a lot of times when they do change stuff, there's actually evidence in that they changed it. And if you're interested in knowing what that thing might be, look up some characters in the Gu Wenzi Gu Lin. They talk a lot about that stuff in there. So what does the Shuowen tell us about sound? Well, he analyzes a character and he says this character has this sound component, or as he would say, cong x sheng. So like say ni, like you, right? he would say 从人 X 声 or sorry 从人 R 声 to annotate that the R next to the 人 is the sound component. And then he's not always right about that, but you do know that at the very least, a Han Dynasty person thought these two things sounded pretty close to each other. And as I mentioned earlier, he also does the X do roll Y. Okay, then we have 市名, which gives this, I mentioned earlier too, the X, Y, ye. And then later dictionaries, so 市名 is like 200 AD. And as I mentioned earlier, the 反切 spellings starts to become popular. I'm not sure that's the right word, but popular around late 2nd century. So dictionaries that come after the 市名 tend to use 反切, like 御篇 or the 经典释文, which is basically a book that just annotates a bunch of the classics. And then after that, it's like, and you notice this is a progression. You start getting into rhyme books. So instead of dictionaries, we have the first extant rhyme book from 601 AD, and a rhyme book gives the 反切 spellings. It also a lot of times will give a meaning gloss. So then what these 反切 spellings are explicitly saying, this character has the same initial as that character. This character has the same rhyme as that character. So based upon, and there's been some very extensive studies into these 反切, and there's a bunch of interesting phenomena that go on with like which characters get used for what. It's not a random thing. In fact, I took historical or 声韵学, like historical phonology or historical Chinese phonology, the undergraduate classes, both of them, there's 2 semesters. And we had to memorize a lot of stuff. And one of the things we had to memorize was every single 反切 shang zi. So that they call, in Chinese, you call the first character in the 反切 pair is called the 反切 shang zi. The second one is called the 反切 xia zi. And if you gather up all the characters that get used as a shang zi, there's like 400-ish. And for the xia zi, there's like 1,200-ish. And we had to memorize all of the 400 反切 shang zi. All of them in their sound values in Middle Chinese. And we had tests on it, like we'd go into class and she'd throw a bunch of 反切 shang zi, and you had to write down what the Middle Chinese initial was, like the Chinese name for it, and the value, and possibly other stuff. It was also a while ago. And then, so the 切韵 is like the first of these rhyme books, and it has an intro, and in the intro the author explains how the book was written, and it's actually really interesting. I had to translate this into modern Baihua for a class I took many years ago, and basically a bunch of guys who were interested in language sat around drinking wine and talking about how characters are pronounced in different parts of China at the time. So it's a really interesting. The preface of the 切韵 is very interesting. It lets you know that people of different times and places are not so different from you. Or perhaps maybe that they are different. And then the rhyme book that gets used, I think, more often would be the 广韵. And 广韵 is actually based on the 切韵. It's an expansion of it. The 广韵appears around 1000 AD. So we're getting in. So 切韵 actually represents early Middle Chinese, whereas 广韵, you're starting to get into the late Middle Chinese period. And then you have the 集韵, but I don't think that the 集韵 is as respected. I'm not sure exactly why. Yeah, so if you end up using actually want to use any of these books for research, you really need to read up on the books and how it became a book, and which is always extremely complicated, especially when you get into like pre-Qin books. I mean, oh my God, you want the process that those things came to be are just so complex. It's unreal. And so one easy way, if you want to look up stuff in these ancient books, is just look up something in the Kangxi Zidian, because a lot of times it will quote these books, though it doesn't always do so accurately. Okay, so those are the rhyme books. Those give us very explicit information. Now, something that grew out of the rhyme book tradition is the rhyme table tradition, and in Chinese you call that 等韵学. So this tradition starts in the Tang Dynasty, or late in the Tang Dynasty, so somewhere around the year, say, 900. And these tables give extremely explicit information. In fact, I have a link here. Let me see if I can show you one of these tables. Oh, no, it didn't do it. I'm a hotkey user and my hotkeys don't work. Get cranky. Okay. So, I don't know if you can see that. John, if you guys can't see that, can you message me so that I know you're not seeing what I'm looking at here? Okay, so I'm going to assume that you guys see the rhyme tables, and what you're looking at here, if you look on the left, you have 4 characters that are in a black circle. Those are the names of Middle Chinese rhyme groups, or yun. So the first one is dong, and if you're speaking Chinese and you're talking about this table, you would call that dong yun. And then on the top, you'll see it starts out on the left with shi yin, or actually actually it's read the other way. It's she yin, shi. Yeah. So the next one is hou yin and chi yin, and these are different types of place of articulation. So like the hou yin is talking about throat sounds, and then under that you'll see like qing, zhuo, qing. So let me give you a specific example. So looking at the hou yin, if you look under the character hou, you have qing, and qing here is saying this is not an unvoiced sound. So in Chinese, to say voiced is qing, unvoiced is qing, and voiced is zhuo. So all the characters under that qing, like wang, all those characters have unvoiced initials, is what that's telling you. And I'm sure you're wondering, what are all these circles? Well, the circles show that there is no word in Chinese that combination of character that has that combination of characteristics. So in other words, looking at the chi, if you look at the most left column there, it has zhuo as the very top part. So for the dong rhyme, there are no yin initials that are zhuo. In fact, there's none for dong or for song, but when you get down to the u rhyme, you do actually have a character. But the circle just means that there is no character or syllable that works for that. So these rhyme, so you can see these rhyme tables show you a lot of very specific information about the nature of the sounds. So we know that, say, in the dong, I guess that's the row, there's 4 dong rows, and all of those characters rhyme with each other. And they have the same tone. Oh, I didn't, sorry. So these 4, the dong, dong, song, u, those are telling you rhyme. So all these characters actually on this whole page have the same rhyme. The ones that are in Middle Chinese tone, ping sheng is dong, and then dong is shang sheng, which is written with shang mian the shang, but for this context it's pronounced with third tone, so shang sheng. And then song is chu sheng, and the last one is ru sheng. So these are all same rhyme, and they're grouped by tone. The horizontal lines represent tone and rhyme, and then the columns, the up and down, is representing place of articulation, plus whether it's there's actually, it's not just voice versus not voice, but there's other characteristics, voice versus, because you have qing, which is unvoiced, and then quan qing, which is completely unvoiced, and ci qing, which is secondarily unvoiced. But it's telling you that. So these tables give a lot of very specific information, and this goes back to 900 AD. So when we're talking about what Chinese sound like around 900 AD and later, we have extremely fine-grained information on what it sounded like. Now, Baxter likes to say we really know more about the categories of sound rather than the actual values of sound. So we know about the relative relationships between sounds much more than we know about the actual, what the value of that sound. When I say value, I mean the actual sound that came out of somebody's mouth. Now there are ways that, so say take Middle Chinese reconstruction. Most of the time what people do with that is they use Chinese dialects and they try to apply the comparative method to Chinese dialects. My throat has, it was fine for the first hour, but it suddenly hit this wall of very thirstiness. Okay, so what was I talking about? Oh, sound values, comparative method. So they applied the comparative method to Chinese dialects to try to trace back what the Middle Chinese sounds would have been. Wow. Okay, it's a good thing I didn't plan on getting through both of these. Wow, I haven't even gotten to the first-hand evidence yet. I just got a message saying I need to wrap up in about 10 minutes. Okay, so real quick, just to close off this rhyme table stuff. Some of the I think probably the most well-known or most used rhyme table is the Yinjing, which has different versions. One of them came out in 1161, another one in 1203. But these actually probably weren't the original ones. These are probably based on yet earlier data. And there's another one called the Qi Yun Lue, which is also based on an earlier work. Yeah, so anyway, that's the explicit data that we have. And just to go over it again, explicit data means somebody's telling you this thing sounds like that thing. This includes rhyme books, rhyme tables, sound glosses, dictionaries, these fanqie spellings, and duruo. So this is all the information we have, and this stuff goes. I mean, usually the later it is in time, the more explicit the information is. But and there's also a lot of uncertainty, and the uncertainty in these things has to do with two main factors: time and place. Like if I take the Shijing was written over a 700-year period, and not all these poems come from the same physical location, and so when I move through time and space throughout this 700-year period, so if you could imagine, well, you probably can't, but you could imagine that such a mapping is possible. But if you think of a 700-year map where you can move along time and then space through like geographical location throughout China, you can imagine that even within the Shijing there's going to be quite a bit of differences in sounds. I mean, even in the U.S., like different locations have different ways of pronouncing stuff. We haven't been in the same location. I mean, when it comes to time and space, time that a group of people have been in a place leads to higher dialect variation, more so than distance does. Though, having mountains in between two sets of people is obviously going to drastically reduce the amount of contact they have with each other, which will most likely increase the divergence of their speech. But this is something you have to keep in mind when you're doing a study on the Shijing. Is like, what is this? What does this represent exactly? Yeah, it's a bunch of poems. Yes, these characters rhyme, but if this character's from the first year of the 700-year period, and this other poem is from the last year of the 700-year period, and they're both from different parts of China, you're starting to talk about some real difference there. And the same thing with, like, say, the Qieyun. The Qieyun, even though there's this preamble, this preface where they talk about what they're doing, there's still a heck of a lot of speculation as to what exactly does this language in the Qieyun represent. And like people, I think Carlgren thought that it was the language of Chang'an, which was the capital of China at the time. But Baxter makes a very good point. He said if you look at a modern English dictionary, what they do is they show you all the possible distinctions that could be made, but no one speaker will make all those distinctions. So in the example he uses, which I'm also from the South, Baxter's from Alabama, my grandparents and my parents are from Mississippi, and I spent time there as a kid, so I'm pretty familiar with the way they talk there. But my grandparents would distinguish between the name Mary, that Merry, and Marry, to marry. Like, so Mary was very merry at Christmas time when she got married to Bob, right? For me, though, in my English, those all sound exactly the same. They're all Mary. Mary was very merry when she married Bob. Sorry, John. So the point I'm trying to make here is, if you think of the Qieyun and it shows you that you have these three different pronunciations for Mary, and to get married, that doesn't mean that all speakers make those distinctions. So Baxter thinks that what the Qieyun represents is just all the distinctions over China, not that it represents the speech of one particular place at a particular time. So even though we have these explicit this explicit set of data, we don't really know there's a lot of uncertainty into when you start getting down in the, as they always say, the devil's in the details. When you get down into the details of the stuff, it's really complicated. And like I mentioned a few minutes ago, just like taking the Shijing and understanding the copy of the Shijing that I have today, what does that thing even mean? Because likely these poems were originally just oral. People just sang them throughout the years and passed them down over the generations, and at some point somebody wrote all this stuff down. But then that was, a really long time in the past, and then it gets edited, and then some other dynasty comes in, and probably the Han dynasty, and changes it around, or they say that Kongzi went in and edited the thing. So if Kongzi edited it, and he lived, what, it was like, I know it was during spring autumn, but like, say this poem's like 800 years before, and he's reading this poem, and then he edits it to where it reflects his own speech. Maybe he sees some previous pronunciation. He thinks it's an error, so he changes it to reflect his speech, and then hundreds of years later, the Han Dynasty guys do the same thing. And then this thing gets transmitted into the future. What in the heck am I actually looking at when I look at this thing? And that's not a trivial thing at all. But I mean, the more people study it, they start to actually notice different phenomena that go on. And we actually do have a kind of an idea of which odes or poems come from which time period. So, I mean, this stuff gets really, I mean, you can really just drop off into an abyss. Like, you could spend your whole life, like easily spend your whole life on trying to understand this stuff. I've spent a lot of time on it myself, and I still a lot of times feel like, man, I really need to know more about that. I need to know more about that, but man, you can't know everything. You can only know, that's why it's important to have a bunch of different people working on it and being critical of each other's work to make sure that, you're making reasonable assumptions, that you're treating your data correctly, that your processes are good, stuff like that. So if we only have a few minutes left, given that we only went over rhyme books, rhyme tables, sound glosses, dictionaries, fanqie, and duruo, I seriously doubt in the next few minutes we can get over the first-hand data. I mean, I guess we should, it'd probably be better to just take questions at this point. Okay. Hopefully there's nothing. Yeah. Well, I mean, it really depends on what you mean by accurate. I mean, from my impression, and like, I'm not an expert on when certain poems were written in the Shijing, but my impression is they know that certain sections, like I can't even remember the section, like Guofeng or something. Like, this section is older than that section, and then this section is older than that section. As far as location, I don't really know, but I would think there are probably books written about this, or maybe chapters of books written about it. Baxter actually talks about this, and I was going to give you guys a book list, but like Baxter 1992, it's very expensive, so you don't want to buy it, but if your library has it, or if you can get a copy online or something, although I am in no way saying to do illegal stuff, but if you can get a copy of Baxter 1992, which is the Handbook of Old Chinese Phonology, it's an extremely thick book, but a lot of it's data, so it's not as thick as, I mean, the reading part of it's not as thick as the book looks, but he goes into a lot of these things that I've talked about actually today already, and I'm pretty sure I can actually, I'll read it before I do next week's and maybe get you a better answer. But I'm pretty sure he has a section on there where he talks about the nature. In fact, one on a, well, I'll just look at it. I'll look at it before next time and get a better answer. Yeah. So, was that the final question, or if there's any other? Well, we did pass the 10 minutes. So, if there aren't any more questions, are there any more questions? John? At least we're not sending smoke signals. Okay, so there aren't any more questions. Okay, so I guess that means next week I'll do this again with a better control over the software. But next week I'll go into the next section, which is the first-hand, or the internal to Chinese data that we have, where people are using a character in a certain way, but they're not telling you, hey, this character sounds like that. They're just using it in a way that shows you that they think it sounds like that. So it's one level more abstract than what we went over. Okay, well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. This is pretty technical stuff, so if it doesn't all make sense in the beginning, then don't worry about it. And I guess we'll post this on YouTube, and if you guys want, or if you're interested, I mean, I could post